This is a controversial subject, and I want to say real quick, too, that Marcus is a gentleman, but you might not like what he's going to say, but I want to hear it.
Well, thank you, Joe, for inviting me. I'm very pleased that you felt able to do so.
And most obvious thing to you that is false, that's not real, that they're trying to sell us with this narrative. That's what I want to know. I want to know which one in your mind is like, this one should be very obvious. This one should stick out. This is the one we should all look at as a trigger to know, hey, something's not right here.
My particular understanding of the Apollo moon landings is that they did not happen the way we were shown. Whether anybody has landed on the moon or not, I doubt very much, but we certainly see no evidence that it's happened. Now, why could this be? Because obviously we've all seen it on television, haven't we? I watched it live. I'm old enough to have watched it live on television when it happened, when the launch took place on July 16th, 1969. I was up at 3:30 in the morning, it was in London, and I watched all that taking place, and then 4 days later they landed on the moon. We saw that live on television, didn't we? Live. It must be true. They wouldn't lie to us, would they? And then I started investigating it. About 25 years after the event, I actually heard somebody give a talk. It was about megalithic architecture, I think it was, or something. He showed lots of photographs, and he said, as an aside, he said, of course, you've probably seen those photographs of the moon landings. Well, they're not real. You know that, don't you? Now, this was about 1990, and I thought, what is he talking about? Of course they're real. I saw it happen. But I was trained as a photographer in London back in the 60s, and I was familiar with the equipment that was used to take the photographs, the Hasselblad cameras, very, very good cameras. So at that time, 1990, it wasn't really possible to look on the internet and check it out there. I had to go out to an astronomy show in London and buy a set of postcards, which I did, so I could look at them. There were photographs in books as well. And when I looked at these photographs, I was becoming increasingly aware that there were some anomalies, some inconsistencies with what we were being told, not least of which were the photographs were extremely good. Now, obviously, if you're an Apollo astronaut, you have the right stuff, so you can do things like take good photographs wearing armored gauntlets in your spacesuit and having no viewfinder on the camera. Of course, that's a bit of a drawback, but they got round that because all the photographs are very well framed, very well focused, which you had to control manually with your armored gauntlets. And you had to set the aperture and the shutter rings manually with your armored gauntlets. And you couldn't see the shutter button from it. These are all things I discovered by examining the evidence for these photographs. And the more I examined them and the more I found the evidence and compared the results as shown by NASA, which, by the way, stands for Never a Straight Answer, or the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or No Astronauts Sent Anywhere, or any of the other quite amusing ways to describe NASA, I thought they were lying, because what I was examining did not square with what I understood photographic film. Now, this is a key point to bear in mind. These were all taken with photographic film. They were not digital images. When they appear on the internet, they've been scanned and entered on the internet as digital images. But the original photographs were taken with film, photographic film. Some people may even remember taking photographs with photographic film. And you take the photographs and then you take the film out of the camera and you send it away to be developed, and you get your pictures back and you look at them and to put them in an album maybe. But these are not digital images. What was taken on the moon was taken using photographic film and manually operated cameras that had no viewfinder. That's a point to remember. I've examined many of the photographs taken on the lunar surface, probably most of them. Actually, there are 5,771 photographs taken on the lunar surface by the 12 Apollo astronauts in the 6 missions that actually landed on the moon. There were 9 missions altogether launched with that whacking great Saturn V rocket, 360 foot high, weighed nearly 3,000 tons, and 1 million people watched Apollo 11 launch on July the 16th, 1969. The launch was real. There's no doubt about that. I'm not questioning that. I'm not disputing that in any way. What I am disputing is what happened 2 minutes after that rocket launched, because then it disappeared from sight. And the only source of information we have from that point on, until we saw those big parachutes lowering the command module back into the Pacific, in the case of Apollo 11, 8 days later, in the case of Apollo 17, 12 days later, the only source of information we have is NASA. They're telling us what's happening, telling us from what's now called the Johnson Space Center, named after Lyndon Baines Johnson, the president who was most instrumental in making sure that the space program got off the ground and continued and eventually was allegedly successful. Now, if these photographs can be demonstrated to be not to have been taken on the moon, there's only one other place they could have been taken, and that's here on Earth. And we know that many, many photographs were taken here on Earth of the lunar landings. They were taken during the training and simulation exercises, which are being conducted quite openly right across America at various sites, Langley, Virginia being one, and we know who also operates out of Langley, Virginia, right across America, right through to Arizona, Flagstaff in Arizona. There was a life-size model, it's about a mile long, of the Sea of Tranquility. It was created by the U.S. Geological Survey by the simple expedient of taking a few sticks of dynamite and blasting a few craters into Cinder Lake, just outside Flagstaff, Arizona. You can go and see it today. It's still there. It's not in quite such good condition because people do off-road driving across it. And then right across into Seattle at Boeing, where they made the lunar rover, down to Lockheed in California, across to Connecticut, where the spacesuits were being made. So this was all happening right across America. There's nothing secret about any of it. And before anybody phones in and says, oh, you can't keep 400,000 people, they can't keep a secret, let's just address that one right from the start. Yes, 400,000 people were involved in the Apollo program at the height of it in 1966. 400,000 people were the numbers who were working for the various contractors who were employed by NASA to manufacture their rockets, their landers, their control centers, the spacesuits, all the various pieces of equipment that would be required to land a man on the moon. There's no dispute about that. Now, these 400,000 people also would include people like drivers and secretaries and security guards and cafeteria staff. They weren't all rocket scientists. There were a few rocket scientists amongst them, obviously, because this was a fairly complex operation. And at that time, in the early 1960s, they were using slide rules. They weren't using computers. They weren't using computer-aided design. That didn't exist. Computers were really quite primitive at that time. So they were using slide rules. And if you're skilled at using a slide rule, you can actually do very, very fast and very accurate calculations. And obviously they were. They understood what was required. So these 400,000 people were doing the very best job they could to achieve the goal set by President John Kennedy in his famous announcement in May 1961 to land a man on the moon before the decade is out and return him safely to the Earth. When he made that announcement on May the 25th, 1961, John Kennedy had only been president for about 4 months. He was elected in 1960, inaugurated in January 1961. He'd already had to deal with the Bay of Pigs fiasco, the very surprising announcement of Yuri Gagarin's first orbit of the Earth in April 1961. And obviously John Kennedy had to come up with something pretty spectacular to demonstrate that America were not frightened by this show of strength by the Soviet Union, as they were called then, that America would meet the challenge and exceed it and demonstrate to the world the technological superiority of America. Fair enough. That's a political decision, and it's something which was obviously going to happen. But at the time he made the announcement, America's total experience in space lasted precisely 15 minutes. And that was Alan Shepard going up and coming straight back down again. So America didn't have a great deal of knowledge of space travel. And many of their rocket launches were rather spectacular failures. The Vanguard rocket exploded on the launch pad, which wasn't very fortunate, seeing as it was broadcast live. Russia seemed to have the edge. So John Kennedy's announcement, using the expertise of his vice president, Lyndon Johnson at the time, was to get America up into space, demonstrably able to show the world how good America was. That's a perfectly legitimate and quite sensible suggestion, which is what he did. From May 1961 until July 1969, when America allegedly landed Apollo 11 on the lunar surface, is just over 7 years. And as a point of comparison, in December 2014, the Orion spacecraft, that's Apollo 2.0, was launched on its one and only launch to date, December 2014. We're coming up to nearly 5 years since it was first launched, and it didn't even go to the moon. It just went 3,500 miles out and came straight back again. Hasn't flown since, primarily because the heat shield of the Orion craft very nearly failed. Anyway, we'll come back to Orion later. So to get back to the 400,000 people who worked on Apollo, yes, they did, but they were compartmentalized. They knew enough to do their own job. This is a military term, compartmentalization, and it was applied to Apollo because it was basically a military operation. It was controlled by the US Air Force. They were in charge in many cases because they were used to flying things. So reasonably enough, they would be the people who would take over and put it into effect, which they did. So compartmentalization means that you're working away on your spacesuit, let's say. You have no need to know what's happening 2,000 miles 2,000 miles west in Seattle, where Boeing are building the first and second stages of the Saturn V rocket. And the guys at Boeing have absolutely no need to know what's happening down in California, where Lockheed are building the landers and the command modules. They have no need to know about that. It's not part of their job. So they're getting on with what they're doing. They don't need to know any more than their job requires them. So 400,000 people worked for Apollo. They were not aware of anything other than what they were doing. They only saw what happened the same way everybody else saw on television. When the rockets took off and we all watched the live broadcast from the moon. Oh, come on, live broadcast from the moon in 1969? Get a grip. That does not happen. It cannot happen. Any broadcast company can tell you the power required to broadcast a TV signal. It's about 30,000 kilowatts, and it will carry about 50 or 60 miles at most.
What you're saying is this whole thing was designed, number one, to prove to the rest of the world that the American, I guess, technological, maybe even the industrial military complex, it was all about putting an image to the rest of the countries that, you know, we're going to be the first ones there, right? That's what it was about.
That's right. And you summed it up very well, actually. That's a very accurate summary of what it was about. That may not have been the original decision. The original decision was probably what John Kennedy said, we'll land a man on the moon before the decade is out and all that. Once they started trying to work out how to do it, they found it was actually a great deal harder than they had thought because of one particular problem that has yet to be overcome, and that's radiation. Because space is full of it. After James Van Allen, after whom those famous belts are named, of Iowa University, sent up a Geiger counter on top of Explorer 4 and discovered the strength of radiation in space, basically they said, hey, space is radioactive. Now, at that time, obviously, radioactivity was a topic of conversation. People were familiar with the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs which had gone off and the damage they had done and the effects they had had, and all the tests that were being carried out in Nevada, the downwinders, remember those? People who were deliberately exposed to radiation without their knowledge. President Clinton eventually agreed that it had happened and apologized for it, but by that time a lot of people had died. So we knew that radiation was a problem. So that had to be overcome. Has it been overcome? No. A few years ago, one of the deputy assistant directors of NASA said, radiation is one of the two major problems of human space travel. We cannot allow astronauts to be exposed to the levels of radiation we know exist in space. It is too much for them to handle. So if that's been discovered now, how come 24 astronauts managed to go on the Apollo craft all the way to the moon and back? It doesn't make any sense. But the point is that from where the camera was mounted on the chest of the astronaut and his head was inside the helmet of the spacesuit, because you can't wear half a spacesuit, you've got to wear the whole thing, helmet, gloves, boots, the lot. Otherwise you'll explode. You can't see them from inside a spacesuit, and that is the problem. Aside from the fact that you can't see the shutter button, which is on the front of the Hasselblad camera, and you can't see the indicator dial on the side of the Hasselblad camera, which tells you if you've taken a photograph, because you don't know if you've taken a photograph, because you can't hear the click, which is the mirror moving out of the way. So with all these limitations of use, I claim that the photographs that we see allegedly taken on the lunar surface could not have been taken by the named astronauts. They were taken by probably professional photographers here on Earth.